The air in Brussels was electric. It was November 2024, and the mood inside the European Commission wasn't just confident, it was triumphant. After months of hesitation, legal hand-wringing and diplomatic back-channeling, the decision had finally been made. In what was heralded as the single most aggressive act of economic statecraft in modern history, the European Union didn't just freeze Russian assets, they moved to confiscate them. $245 billion. To put that number into perspective, that is larger than the entire GDP of Greece, New Zealand, or Qatar. It was a war chest accumulated by Moscow over decades, now seized by a stroke of a pen in Brussels. The narrative was perfect. This was the ultimate punishment for aggression. It was a demonstration of Western unity. It was supposed to be the moment the Russian economy finally snapped, forcing a regime change or a humiliating surrender. Politicians toasted to their own bravery. The media ran headlines celebrating the moral victory. They thought the game was over. They thought they had checkmated the Kremlin without firing a single shot. But while the champagne corks were popping in Brussels, a printer was whirring in a nondescript office in Geneva, and then another in London, and another in Singapore. 72 hours later, the celebration stopped dead cold. It arrived not as a missile strike, nor as a cyber attack on the power grid. It arrived as a document, a single monolithic legal filing, 847 pages of dense weaponized jurisprudence, filed simultaneously in 14 different jurisdictions across 3 continents. What followed was not the collapse of the Russian economy, but the slow-motion unraveling of the European legal order. Within 2 weeks, the panic in Western capitals was palpable. Within a month, the $245 billion seizure, Europe's nuclear option, began to look less like a victory and more like a suicide pact. This is the untold story of the most sophisticated legal warfare operation in history. This is how Russia took Europe's greatest weapon, turned it around, and pointed it straight at the heart of the Western financial system. And the terrifying part? It's working. To understand the magnitude of the trap, we first have to understand the nature of the seizure. When the conflict escalated in 2022, the G7 nations froze roughly $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves. The vast majority of this, about $245 billion, was sitting in Europe, specifically within the vaults of Euroclear in Belgium. For 2 years, this money sat in purgatory. It was frozen, meaning Russia couldn't touch it, but neither could Europe. It was a stalemate, but political patience is a finite resource. Under immense pressure to fund the reconstruction of Ukraine and facing budget deficits at home, European leaders decided to cross the Rubicon. They moved from freezing to seizing. They justified this under a patchwork of new legal theories, framing the seizure as a form of advance reparations. They argued that because Russia had violated international law, Russia had forfeited its sovereign rights to these assets. It sounded morally righteous. It played well on television. But behind closed doors, the legal advisors to the European Council were terrified. They knew something the politicians chose to ignore. The global financial system is not built on morality. It is built on trust, and specifically on the concept of sovereign immunity. Sovereign immunity is the bedrock of international relations. It is the ancient principle that one state cannot sit in judgment of another state's public acts. It is the reason why a country's embassy cannot be entered by local police, and why a central bank's reserves are considered sacrosanct. By seizing these assets, Europe wasn't just punishing Russia, they were taking a sledgehammer to the foundation of the global economy. Russia knew this, and for 2 years, they waited. They didn't scream, they didn't panic, they simply prepared. The counterattack, when it came, was a masterclass in asymmetrical warfare. Russia did not use Russian lawyers. They knew that a defense led by Moscow-based attorneys would be dismissed as propaganda. Instead, they quietly assembled a dream team. They hired the sharpest legal minds from the very countries trying to rob them. We are talking about top-tier barristers from London, constitutional experts from Paris, and investment treaty specialists from Switzerland. These were the people who wrote the textbooks on international law. The 847-page filing they produced was not a rant. It was a surgical dissection of European hypocrisy. They identified a fatal flaw in Europe's strategy. The EU had relied on the argument that these assets were state property, subject to civil enforcement. But the Russian legal team argued a nuanced, irrefutable point. Central bank reserves are not ordinary property. Under the UN Convention on Jurisdictional Immunities of States, central bank reserves held for monetary policy purposes enjoy absolute immunity. This is not a suggestion. It is a rule that European courts themselves had upheld for decades. By seizing these reserves, Russia argued Europe wasn't just attacking Russia, they were breaking their own laws. But the genius of the Russian strategy was in the jurisdictional shotgun approach. They didn't just sue in the European Court of Justice. They filed in the International Court of Justice, ICJ. They filed in the European Court of Human Rights, ECHR. They filed with the Permanent Court of Arbitration. They filed in commercial courts in London, Zurich, and Singapore. They even triggered arbitration clauses in obscure bilateral investment treaties, BITs. This created a Hydra problem for Europe. To win, Europe has to win every single case in every single jurisdiction. If they lose just one, if a single judge in Switzerland or Singapore rules that the seizure was illegal, the entire legal framework collapses. Russia, on the other hand, only needs to win once. The filing contained a bomb that no one expected. Buried within the appendices of the Russian legal complaint were documents that sent a chill down the spine of every bureaucrat in Brussels. These were internal European Union communications, emails, memos, and draft legal opinions from the European Council's own legal service. These documents showed that Europe's own lawyers had warned the politicians that the seizure was illegal. They showed that member states were deeply divided. They showed that the decision was driven by political optics, not legal standing. How did Russia get these documents? Was it a hack, a leak, a disgruntled insider? The answer almost didn't matter. The damage was done. By presenting Europe's own internal doubts as evidence, Russia proved bad faith. In international law, acting in bad faith, knowing something is illegal but doing it anyway, destroys your defense. It was a humiliating public undressing. Russia was essentially saying to the judges, "Don't take our word for it. Look at what their own lawyers said before they were silenced." This created a paranoia loop in Brussels. Who is leaking? Who can we trust? The unity of the EU began to fracture from the inside out. While the lawyers fought in court, the economists began to scream. Russia's filing included a terrifying argument regarding global financial stability. They argued that if a central bank's reserves can be seized by political decree, then no reserves anywhere are safe. This argument wasn't aimed at the judges, it was aimed at the markets, and the markets listened. Almost immediately, we saw the beginning of a silent run on the euro. Central banks in the global south, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, Indonesia, China, began quietly diversifying away from the euro. They realized that holding assets in Europe was now a liability. If they disagreed with Brussels on climate policy or human rights or trade, their money could be next. This is the nightmare scenario for the European Central Bank, ECB. The euro's value depends on its status as a safe reserve currency. If that status is eroded, borrowing costs for European governments skyrocket. Furthermore, let's talk about Euroclear. This is the clearinghouse in Belgium where most of these assets are held. Euroclear is the plumbing of the global financial system. By forcing Euroclear to violate its own contracts, the EU turned a neutral utility into a geopolitical weapon. Russia's lawsuits named Euroclear as a co-defendant. Now, Euroclear is facing potentially unlimited liability. If a court rules the seizure illegal, Euroclear could be technically bankrupt. The risk to the European financial infrastructure is so high that the ECB privately warned the European Commission that this seizure could trigger a 2008-style financial crisis. Here is a detail the mainstream news missed completely. the insurance market. Billions of dollars of European trade and investment are backed by political risk insurance. These policies pay out if a government illegally seizes assets. When Russia filed its lawsuits arguing that the seizure was illegal, it triggered a panic among major insurers like Lloyd's of London and Allianz. If the courts rule in Russia's favor, it establishes that illegal expropriation took place. This could trigger massive payouts on insurance policies held by Russian entities or companies doing business with them. Suddenly, European insurance giants found themselves in a bizarre position. Financially, they might need Russia to win. If Russia wins, the legal clarity might be less expensive than the chaos of an ongoing undefined conflict. The seizure made European business uninsurable. This brings us to the core of the Russian strategy. It is pure judo. In judo, you do not oppose your opponent's strength, you use it against them. Europe's greatest strength is its adherence to the rule of law. Europe prides itself on independent judiciaries that are not beholden to politicians. Russia is using that very independence against Europe. They are betting that European judges, who care deeply about the integrity of their legal system, will refuse to rubber stamp a political theft. If a European court rules against the EU faces an impossible choice. Obey the court. Return the money to Russia. This is a total political humiliation and a victory for Putin. Ignore the court. Keep the money. This proves to the world that Europe's rule of law is a lie, destroying their moral authority forever. There is no good option. Europe is trapped in a dilemma of its own making. This is why, right now, the tone in Western capitals is shifting. Publicly, the rhetoric is still tough. But privately, the European legal teams are advising settlement. They are looking at the 14 jurisdictions, the exploding legal costs, already in the hundreds of millions, and the risk of a catastrophic precedent, and they are blinking. Whispers of a negotiated solution are circulating. The proposal? Return the bulk of the assets to Russia in exchange for a token payment to Ukraine, or perhaps a long-term bond arrangement. Think about what that means. It means the most aggressive sanction in history is being walked back. It is an admission of defeat. Russia's strategy wasn't to get the money back tomorrow. It was to make keeping the money so painful, so expensive, and so legally dangerous for Europe that Europe would beg to give it back. The implications of this extend far beyond the war in Ukraine. This is the death knell of the Western sanctions regime as we know it. For 70 years, the US and Europe used economic sanctions as their primary stick. They worked because they were viewed as irresistible. But Russia has just provided a blueprint for how to defeat them. China is taking notes. They are watching every motion filed, every argument made. They are currently rewriting their own laws and restructuring their own reserves based on the vulnerabilities Russia exposed in the European system. By overreaching, Europe has inadvertently inoculated its adversaries. They have accelerated the development of a parallel financial system, one where Western laws do not apply. In the end, this $245 billion seizure will likely be remembered not as a triumph of justice, but as a monumental strategic blunder. Europe thought they were robbing a bank. Instead, they rigged their own banking system with explosives and handed the detonator to Moscow. The money sits frozen in legal limbo, useless to Ukraine, inaccessible to Russia, and radioactive to Europe. The legal battles will drag on for a decade. The lawyers will get rich. The politicians will eventually move on. But the damage to the trust in Western financial institutions? That is permanent. We are witnessing the end of an era. The era where the West could simply turn off the money tap to punish its enemies is over. Russia didn't just survive the economic war. With one brilliant 847-page legal maneuver, they fundamentally changed the rules of the game. And as the European leaders look at the mounting legal bills and the fleeing capital, they are left with the haunting realization: they might have seized the assets, but they have lost the war.